Senator Hatch.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first want to ask consent to place a few items in the record. I have a statement for myself and one submitted by our Attorney General of our great state, Mark Shurtleff. Now, Utah is an original plaintiff in this multi-state lawsuit, and of course, Judge Vinson singled out Utah as having standing as well. Attorney General Shurtleff has been at the head of the pack in fighting for individual liberty and state sovereignty, and I'm very proud of Utah's role in this. So I ask consent for Judge Vinson's opinion to be part of the record, as well as the friend of the court brief filed in that case by 32 senators, including several members of this committee. And finally, I ask consent that a few of the articles that I've published on this subject in newspapers such as the Wall Street Journal and Chicago Tribune and the Regent Journal of Law and Public Policy, if I could have those in the record as well, Mr. Chairman. Now, it's already been said that the distinction between activity and inactivity is not in the text of the Constitution. I think most all of you have said that. A textualist is born. But neither are words such as, quote, substantial effects, unquote, or, quote, broader regulatory scheme, unquote, or anything else the Supreme Court has come up with that defenders of Obamacare rely on. And there is no, quote, intrusiveness, unquote, standard in the Constitution either. Would you agree with that, Professor Burnett?
Of course, that's not a constitutional standard or doctrine that I'm aware of.
Well, none of them are. Mr. Corbin?
Right. No, obviously, things that substantially affect commerce is something that the court says is within the Commerce Clause, but has been pointed out, there's a number of things that affect commerce, violence against women, possessing guns, which the court has said, no, those don't come within the ambit. And I would argue that economic inactivity is far more afield from the commerce power than things like buying and possessing guns.
I'm very grateful to have Professor Freed here. He's a grand old friend. Professor Dellinger's an old friend, both of whom I admire greatly. I don't know you, Mr. Kroger, but I'm sure you're just fine. The Congressional Budget Office in the past has said that requiring individuals to purchase a particular good or service was, quote, unprecedented, unquote. Now, that's the Congressional Budget Office. The Congressional Research Service recently concluded that, quote, it is a novel issue whether Congress may use the Commerce Clause to require an individual to purchase a good or service, unquote. I think it is a novel issue, I submit, because Congress has never done it before. Now, I'll throw this question to each of our witnesses and hope I get straight answers. Can you give me an actual example, other than Obamacare, of Congress requiring individuals to purchase a particular good or service?
Senator, if I may, my parents own a small business. They're constituents of Senator Cornyn's. And if you told them that the government had never required them to buy a good or service, they would be astounded. I mean, the federal OSHA law and regulations require all kinds of sole proprietors and small business people to go out and buy equipment, whether it's orange cones or hard hats or a fire disposal system in a restaurant. The environmental laws require a huge range of small business owners to buy air filters, up to, sulfur oxide scrubbers. The reason small business people tend not to like government regulation, and particularly federal regulation, is because it does require them to expend money on goods and services. And so I don't think, I think those are...
Only as a condition of being in business.
Senator,
I mean, these people are trying to get into business.
It's true that my parents could close down their business. All people could close down their business.
Well, they don't have to, because they can go into business, but as a condition to going into it, they have to meet certain laws, right?
Yes,
in this particular case, we have an inactivity of people, if you want to use that word. I don't find it the greatest word in the world, but we have an inactivity here that they don't want to do. And they would make their choice not to do it. Let me go to you, Professor Freed.
I think the idea that one can make a choice not to seek health care throughout one's life is simply not realistic, and cannot be the basis for an attack on the
Well,
constitutionality.
it isn't right. I'll have to concede that point. But that still begs the question of whether it should be mandated.
Well, I think once you've made the first step and you've made that first concession, the rest follows.
Okay.
I am brought to mind the various things that were considered in the Senate and which the previous president, I think, very wisely suggested as an alternative to Social Security. And as an alternative, it was suggested that you could buy mutual funds from Vanguard, from Fidelity, and you wouldn't have to buy it from the government. And maybe one would say that, well, you don't have to work. You can simply, sit on a corner and say spare change, and then you wouldn't have to pay Social Security.
Well,
but I think that's unrealistic as well.
Let me go to Mr. Carvin. I only have a few seconds left. Mr. Carvin.
No, they've never done it before, and if you buy any of the analogies that have been just agreed to, then there is no limits on Congress. The notion that health care is unique because you have to buy the goods is facially incorrect. You have to buy transportation, clothes, housing, shelter, food. The notion that health insurance is somehow a core requirement is kind of silly, and of course, if you started drawing these distinctions between transportation and healthcare, you get back into the sort of principled, unprincipled distinctions of bedeviled Commerce Clause jurisprudence prior to at least the 1930s.
Mr. Burnett?
Absolutely. It has never been done before, Senator. And the fact is that even though everyone might be said to one day you need health care, the bill itself exempts people from buying health. Health insurance is not the same thing as health care. Everyone doesn't go into the insurance market, and the bill exempts people for religious reasons from having to obtain health insurance. So clearly, even Congress recognized that not everyone has to obtain health insurance just because they may or may not one day seek medical care. So the fact that medical care is an inevitability, which it isn't for everyone, but if it, to the extent that it's likely, doesn't mean insurance, a completely different product, is an inevitability.
Walter?
Senator, my understanding is that the very first Congress required every adult-free male to purchase and equip themselves with muskets, with ammunition, with even certain forms of dress and to carry the weapons and equipage with them. It is true that...
but you got to admit that the
it's been a long time.
Provides guidance for that.
It's been a long time since then. Yes, you can say when something hasn't been done before that it's novel or unprecedented, but no matter how much one italicizes those words, it doesn't amount to a constitutional argument. This is novel in the sense that Congress has decided to use a market approach, and it's used it with regard to the purchase of a commodity that truly is unlike others. There's nothing else in our economy where an individual who has made no preparation for the expense could go in and get $1 million worth of goods and services provided to them, the cost of which is passed on to others. There's nothing like that. So in that truly unique market, an incentive for people to make provision through insurance seems unremarkable.
Well, the reason I raise it is for the purpose of showing that it has never been done before, and I think there are good reasons why it has never been done before. But I've asked the distinguished chairman if he'll just let me make a couple more remarks. I have a lot of other things I'd like to ask, but my time is up, and if you'll indulge me, I'd appreciate that. You know, because no Commerce Clause cases involve Congress regulating decisions rather than activities, that renders this case as a case of first impression, which is my point. The ObamaCare backers cite mandates that derive from different enumerated powers. They argue, for example, as some of you have argued here, I've been very interested in these arguments, that Congress has imposed mandates on individuals before such as jury service, the military draft, or Social Security. Professor Freed has made this argument. And simply because One provision of the Constitution allows Congress to require that someone do something cannot mean that the Commerce Clause allows the Congress to impose an individual insurance mandate. Jury duty, for example, that has been mentioned, has multiple layers of exceptions, and they make it far less than compulsory for most people. It is also, quote, necessary and proper, unquote, in order to exercise Congress's power to establish lower courts and to implement the Sixth Amendment right to trial by an impartial jury. Congress may impose a military draft, which again has layers of exceptions, pursuant to enumerated powers to raise and support armies, and they can close them and ask them to have guns as well, and maintain a navy. And the Social Security system, which has been raised here, is, unlike this insurance mandate, unequivocally an exercise in Congress's power to tax and spend for the general welfare. It's a completely different issue as far as I'm concerned. Now, each of these examples stands clearly with an enumerated power. The insurance mandate does not. And I think, great scholars that you are, I think you have to admit that. If Congress could impose, and that doesn't say that I'm right and you're wrong, but it does make it very more clear. If Congress could impose any mandate on an individual, because it may impose a particular mandate on certain individuals, there would be no limits to federal power at all. And that's where I'm having a lot of difficulty here, and I've had a lot of difficulties. I've studied this matter. Now, I've got to say, I respect all of you. And I respect the differences in points of view. But for the life of me, Professor Freed, I have a great regard for you, but I'm really amazed at some of your arguments here today. Great man that you are. And now I expected them from Walter Dellinger.
Thank goodness I have General Freed with me.
It's wonderful not to lose one's power to surprise.
Well, you've never lost that power. I have to say that I probably agree with you much more on many other issues than I do here. But I've really enjoyed this. I've really appreciated you taking the time here. This is a very, very important issue. And Walter, Professor Dellinger, I want you to at least realize that the liberal point of view should be protecting our rights, not necessarily broadening them in the sense of making us have to buy health insurance.
Senator, just a brief comment. I think you make obviously a very good point that most legislation,
I thought they were points.
well, you made one that I thought was
Okay, one. Okay.
and that is that most legislation, state and federal, prohibits individuals from doing things. But there's always been some legislation, state and federal, that imposes affirmative obligations.
No question.
That doesn't mean that, in that sense, it's unremarkable to impose affirmative obligations, though I think our...
You can find those in the Constitution, which is my point.
I think well, but it's also true it's the commerce power that Congress uses to build interstate highways and tells people that they have to move and take a check from the government. It's the commerce power that does that. So that there are lots of affirmative obligations. Now, I think we should be very attentive. Affirmative obligations can be more intrusive, and therefore we have to take a careful look to make sure that they don't transcend any limits. This, to me, it seems easily does not.
Well, I have transcended my limits, and I apologize to the distinguished chairman, but I appreciate him giving me this little leeway because I have to leave, and I just want to thank each one of you for coming.